I think that the challenge that exists in this moment in time are not different than the problems that existed before the pandemic. The kind of difference now, there's a difference on two fronts. One is that the pandemic really distills everything down. It unmasks and amplifies things in ways that weren't as evident before the pandemic, but they were still there. So you've seen power unmasked and amplified all over the world. I think you see now a sort of tipping point where it's close to majority, calling into question the legitimacy of power. My name's Andrea Reimer. I teach, I'm an educator, and I also provide strategic advice to municipal governments and nonprofit organizations. I do many things, but I'd probably put it in the broad buckets of teaching about power. I'm really interested in trying to figure out how we can increase power literacy. The second particular challenge of the pandemic is this liminal space-time that we're in. Functionally, it's very similar to when you're traveling, where you have a lot of anticipation and anxiety, but as soon as you get out the door and on the way, you're in this different time space. I think in an airplane, it's sort of the most pronounced that we feel it, where the rules that applied before we got on the airplane aren't in effect, but we're not yet where we're going, so those rules don't yet apply. And the pandemic's really similar. The rules around the time we're in and the one that we're going to have not yet been written. I refer to it as the Schrodinger's cat of public policy, where all things are both possible and impossible at exactly the same time. Until we land and until the pandemic is largely under control, we don't know what that future will look like. Generally, the neoliberal trend that started in the 80s has deepened and worsened. This mythology that if you work hard and you just put your shoulder to it, that you should be able to be the richest person in a country. Those are the policies that have largely been determining the last 40 years. The price of that has been the many falling further and further behind. And that push between the many, mass movements that we've seen springing up. So this idea that we can all come together and push for better policy and push for policies that serve the interests of the many, or at least more than the ones that currently do, have had a really hard time translating into electoral politics. When the pandemic started, we were in that moment of trying to figure out, can you translate the movement into electoral politics? The pandemic makes it much more possible. Before, you were standing on ground and you knew what that ground looked like. You knew who your opponents were. Now the ground, if it exists at all, is quite liquid. And what might be true today may not be true tomorrow. So that makes it much more difficult to move forward in a way that is predictable or mappable. The big opportunity of this moment is the word yes. If you think of the word mass movement, you're thinking of something pushing against something, about saying no or many no's, which are legitimate no's. Like, I don't want to invalidate that. There are many, many things about the world that existed before the pandemic and continue to exist that we need to say no to. Things like fossil fuel expansion at a time when we know that it's killing the planet. Things like anti-Black racism or anti-Indigenous racism. Like, we know these things are killing people in huge numbers and that they're not things that we can bring into a post-pandemic world. But until we learn how to paint the world we want, the yes, we're never going to win it, right? If you give people a choice between a vision of the future that has structure and is clear versus a great unknown, they're going to choose the clarity, even if it's against their self-interest to do so. Movements have historically had trouble, at least in the last 40 years, mobilizing beyond no into yes. So when you hear people talking about universal basic income, or you hear them talking about broadly this idea of a Green New Deal or a green recovery, that's the glimmer of yes that we need to see, that needs to be built into a really vibrant picture if it's going to have a chance at success. Because if we're fighting yes with no, we're going to lose. But if we're fighting with a yes, we will win that battle. It's not that my vision or your vision of the future is distasteful for people or that we have to work hard to sell it. We need to work hard to learn how to articulate it, because we've spent a long time fighting against visions of the future that aren't appealing. We've learned the language of no, and we need to get it out if we're going to be successful. Over the last 40 years, there's been this oppositional force, right? This carefully constructed, self-interested structure of neoliberalism. I'm 48, so I've spent my entire life fighting against that structure. Now, The artifact of that is that it's easy for me not to take responsibility because there's this big thing I've been fighting against that is the power. I have to learn how to take responsibility for my power. What if I were in charge? What if I'm making decisions? And what if those decisions have consequences that aren't perfect? How am I going to take responsibility now for owning that? Having been in power in a government for a decade here in Vancouver, it's difficult for a group of people who've organized politically only ever against things to not only be for things, but understand that you have to take responsibility for the outcomes of the things you're for, which are not ever going to be 100%. There's always going to be someone who has an impact that isn't positive as a result of policies being passed. So you can work to mitigate that, but you still have to own that space. You need to learn how to square these circles and be able to work towards much more textured discussion than yes or no around things. The other thing that needs to happen is understanding right now in this time, this liminal space, we're not actually pushing up against anything other than ourselves, our own sense of victimhood, or our own sense that we can't change things or things are too big for us to change, because the other side is standing on the same fluid ground that we are, right? Like, this is the moment where we can push forward. We don't have to push against something to get there. But getting your mind wrapped around that is a challenge when you've spent your entire life fighting something rather than pushing forward towards something. The fundamental question of all politics is a question of power. Who has power? How much power do I have? And how much power does someone else hold over me? In many communities, that manifests as the literal question of who owns the streets, who gets to decide what happens in public space, who gets to decide what happens in private space, right? Like, for some communities, some cultures, some countries, that is still an open question in ways that we would never tolerate in North America. And yet we completely tolerate corporate, private, moneyed interests getting to decide how much public space is allocated to them and then what's left over for the rest of us. It's suddenly all on the table. I've seen it here in Vancouver on housing. I spent 10 years fighting for things like temporary modular housing to get people inside, them safe from chronic diseases that they might be exposed to, the elements, just the sheer grind of poverty that weighs on you all the time. But if you don't have safe, stable housing, it's going to crush you. Now, everybody wants to see that housing built as fast as humanly possible, because when people are safe inside, you're safe when you're outside, right? So these questions have become just completely flipped on their head if there are community leaders prepared to push forward on making them a reality. For the first time in my life, all things are possible. This liminal space in the pandemic has created this total change, but the flip side is that all things are also impossible. It sounds like a paradox, but it's not. It's just the sound of the future being created. It probably always sounds like that, but the pandemic is the first time that it's been quiet enough that we can actually hear it.